Very good warm welcome to everybody that's tuned in. My name is Martha Nangolo, and I'll be your moderator for today for the Ask the Expert session for today. It's another session where we'll be cluing up journalists and other stakeholders on the relations of COVID-19. As we all know, we're currently in the pandemic and it's affecting each and every one of us. I am joined today by Mr. Frederico Links, who is the editor of the Namibia Fact Check, as well as a leading researcher on the procurement tracker. He will be indulging with us in terms of questions pertaining to the procurement, not only here in Namibia, but other issues as well that are trending around the world that are affecting procurement and the issues around COVID-19. Federico, hello.
Good morning, Martha.
Good morning. Can you give us a brief introduction, Federico, of what you do before we delve into the discussions of today?
All right, so I am the lead researcher and coordinator of the Procurement Tracker Namibia project of the Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPR, here in Namibia. And we've been running the Procurement Tracker project since 2018. As you might know, the new Public Procurement Act of 2015 was operationalized in 2017, since 1 April 2017. And we've sort of been tracking the implementation of the act, of the new law since then. And that is the purpose and the aim of the Procurement Tracker Namibia project. So we publish sort of a quarterly newsletter annually, so 4 times a year. And we've been doing that for the last 2.5 years now. And I mean, what we look at mostly is the sort of governance issues around transparency and accountability within the public procurement system. That's our focus. And all the Procurement Tracker Namibia additions to date can be found on the Institute for Public Policy Research website, if anybody wants to go and take a look at them and look at the issues that we've been addressing over the last few years in regarding the public procurement space. It's all there. And it speaks to the concerns we've had since the new law was actually operationalized in 2017.
Thank you, Federico. For those of you that are joining us in, I see a few people are joining us in. This is the Ask the Expert session, and today we're looking at issues of COVID procurement in the era of COVID-19. This session was brought to you by the Namibia Media Trust, as well as in support from the DW Akademie. Now, we are streaming this live from or on Facebook, but please feel free to go on our other social media platforms, such as Twitter, under the tag @NamMediaTrust, if you have any specific questions, or you can email them to info@nmt.africa, and we will try and link them in, or otherwise you can just put them in the chat and we will definitely address them to the expert. Federico, now we all have heard about what procurement is. We talk about public procurement and we kind of have an understanding, but I mean, this has become such a complex issue for most people, even in the case of journalists, and not only them, but as well as citizens. I want to understand, why should journalists or media take an interest in public procurement?
Well, I mean, everybody should take an interest in public procurement. Public procurement is about government service delivery. It is actually the single biggest and most critical function of government, because procurement affects the quality and the nature of service delivery. It affects how taxpayer monies are spent. So that is why we as citizens, that is why journalists, that is why decision makers have to keep an eye on what's happening in the public procurement space, because it is about the quality of governance that flows from how money is being spent by the state.
So often, a lot of people, especially the laymen, have no understanding as to that. What exactly is your agenda in focusing on public procurement? Maybe if you can break it down for us as well.
We've been asked this question, especially as we've come into elections since last year, since the 2019 presidential and national assembly elections, and again now with the regional local authority elections coming up actually tomorrow. The question has been asked, I mean, what is our agenda? Are we motivated to make government look bad? Is our agenda an anti-government agenda? And the answer is no. I mean, as I said in just previously, it's not about we aren't politically associated in what we do. We aren't politically motivated. This is about governance. This is about how Namibian resources are being spent. This is about how the Namibian economy is being managed. This is about giving people access to information that actually affects their lives in the context of government service delivery. And this is what it's about. I mean, public procurement is by nature a political issue. Because it deals with how politicians make decisions around state expenditure, around contracting, and so forth. So it is a political issue, and it cannot be separated from politics, because political parties, especially around election times, make claims and pronouncements and promises about spending related issues, for instance, on things like housing and sanitation and various other service delivery related issues that touch on spending and touch on public procurement and contracting. So these are issues that necessarily are politically intertwined with the nature of governance and who holds power and how power is wielded in the public interest.
Frederico, public procurement has already been a contentious issue. We've been seeing it all over the media space, whether it be print media, wherever it is, people have been complaining, whether it be opposition, whatever it is, whether it's in the parliament. I want to know, what has the picture changed now that we're in the era of COVID-19 in regards to the space of public procurement? I mean, there have been a lot of questions rising to say that, some of the procedures that were not necessarily run under because of the urgency of certain services or goods during the COVID-19. What's exactly has there been a shift in the space of public procurement during the era of COVID-19?
Yes, I mean, what's been happening is that when we went into lockdown in late March this year, lockdown, it was parallel. A parallel process was through ministerial directive. The COVID-19, the public procurement rules, the normal rules, were suspended for the period of that lockdown period until early May this year. And so, and through the state of emergency, which lasted up to September this year, this directive or these rules were in place, and so all public procurement in that period was done through the emergency procurement method, which is direct procurement. So that is a massive change. And if you look at the number of procurement actions that were undertaken through this method, you know, a lot of money was being spent, and you know, it needs to be accounted for what happened during this period, because the default should be open contracting, open competitive contracting, open competitive bidding. But we had this, and this was an extraordinary period. We have to recognize that, and you know, procurement had to be undertaken expeditiously. You had to necessarily do things faster than they would have normally had to be done because of the extraordinary circumstances that COVID-19 has brought about. So we understand that, but it also means that extra care has to be taken because of the suspension of the normal processes. Extra care has to be taken to ensure that whatever methods are adopted in the public procurement space, that you know, the processes are sound, that transparency and accountability are maintained as per the Public Procurement Act of 2015, which right up front in the legal texts talks about transparency, accountability, integrity, and other principles. So you have to ensure that these principles are held intact, even in extraordinary circumstances. And this is what has been of concerning, and not just in Namibia, in other parts of the world as well, in other parts of this region as well.
Thanks, Frederico. I want to get into the issues of concern, if you will. I know that you recently published a paper, and we'll get into that, into talking about that. But you just mentioned right now to say that there are principles that were supposed to be set out and laid out. And you made mention about how during this period, initially through at the beginning of lockdown, we found ourselves doing direct procurement. What are some of the dangers in doing that, in government taking that approach as opposed to taking the guidelines that have been put already out as per the Procurement Act? Maybe for journalists to also get an understanding, and if I may, for you to kind of explain it to the layman's, because so often we talk about guidelines, we talk about transparency, we talk about good governance, but what are the dangers of government not sticking to their own rules?
Well, I mean, the dangers is that we open up the system to nefarious dealings. You know, you open it up to corruption, you open it up to mismanagement, you open it up to waste, because you're abusing a system, you're abusing certain methods of procurement, you're not compliant with the law. So there are various dangers, and this all can lead to a situation where you know, there's a deterioration in service delivery, a deterioration in the quality of governance, and a culture of corruption, of impunity can set in a system that is mismanaged in a way that enables such practices to get a grip and get hold of the system. So it's you know, we need to emphasize that that it is of utmost importance. It is critical that the integrity of the systems and of the processes and of the institutions at the heart of these critical systems and processes, that the integrity of this sort of infrastructure is held intact. And it's necessary that you know, that compliance with the law is the culture. Now that compliance with the law is a major issue at this stage on the public procurement landscape. And this is, this is an issue that was brought out numerous times in a speech by the Prime Minister at a public procurement conference with state entities in middle of last year, where she repeatedly underscored the issue of non-compliance with the law amongst public sector entities in her speech. And the Minister of Finance also at the time, Kalle Schletwein, also spoke about at this 2019 procurement conference about issues regarding compliance with the law. And since then, I mean, there have been sort of issues that we've kept monitoring the situation, and compliance with the law is still an issue within the public procurement system. And this is 3-4 years after the law has been operationalized, after, sort of the entities, the institutions at the heart of the system have been created and introduced. We are still struggling across the state sector with public entities struggling to incorporate the systems that need to be in place internally, and to have those systems work appropriately and optimally. This is still a big issue. So, I mean, these are things that senior government officials, such as the Prime Minister herself, such as the Finance Minister, have pointed out, as I mentioned, over the years. So, I mean, these are the big concerns that we also have, because we fear that the culture that permeated the old tender board system and that eventually contributed to the doing away of that outdated system with the introduction of the new law, we fear that the culture that sort of permeated that old system has now become the culture within the new public procurement system, which, I mean, as I said, it speaks to improved accountability, improved transparency, improved integrity mechanisms throughout the system. That's what it says on paper. We would like to see that in reality. But unfortunately, I mean, the struggles within the system paint a completely different picture of what's busy happening in the public procurement system. I don't know if I've answered the question, or
yes,
there were two parts to that question. Yeah.
You
Okay,
have.
thank you.
Just to remind everyone that's just logging on right now, welcome to the Ask the Expert session. We're talking to Mr. Frederico Links on procurement issues in the era of COVID-19. Please feel free to send your questions. That's to our social media platforms, whether it be in the Facebook Live chat session or whether you're on the Zoom as well. You can also put your question there, and we'll deliberate on that later. We're also taking questions via email on info@nmt.africa, as well as our Twitter account, which is @NamTrust. Now, Frederico, you recently published a briefing paper on the red flags in public procurement. This is through IPPR in conjunction with Nesta, where you're talking about the warning signs of fluttering over emergency procurement practices. I want to understand, what were these red flags that you're talking about in this briefing paper? If you can briefly sum it up for us.
So earlier in the year, we were looking at what was happening in various other, the reports started coming out in various other countries about procurement, disturbing procurement practices. And there have now been a number of studies from around the world around procurement, public procurement in the era of COVID-19. And we started looking at some of these reports, and we started wondering, are these issues that we should be looking at in Namibia as well? Are some of these practices, visible in Namibian public procurement landscape? And so we looked at, how are we going to assess this? And we looked at the risk indicators generated by international civil society organizations such as the Open Contracting Partnership, Corruption Watch in South Africa, and some others that had already, developed risk indicators around corruption in public procurement. And so we looked at some of these risk indicators and decided, why don't we adapt some of these indicators, adopt and adapt some of these indicators and see if we can find the red flags on the Namibian public procurement landscape, whether we can see these same risk indicators here. And so we adapted some of them from some of these other organizations, and we applied them to what we were seeing happening and on the public procurement landscape through the data sets that we had access to. And these were data sets that are accessible through the Ministry of Finance website, other data sets that we directly requested from various government departments, and from a report that was produced by the Procurement Policy Unit in the Ministry of Finance around emergency procurement or the use and misuse of emergency procurement from 2017 through 2019. Sorry. So we applied these risk indicators. Now, these were the risk indicators that we used were short tender periods, the use of non-competitive bidding methods, bidding processes, the invitation to bid that is limited to one or a few bidders. And then also we decided to look at, what sort of information could we come across, that could we access around the companies that were getting contracts during this time, as well as some companies that had gotten contracts through emergency procurement in 2017, 2018, and 2019, according to this report that we have from the Procurement Policy Unit. So we looked at these lists and we decided to look at some of these companies. Now we could find, if in terms of the red flags, we found the issue of short turnaround times in bidding was prevalent. Where in a lot of cases you had a tender period of 1 day, 24 hours in many cases, or a few days, 3 days, or at most 5, 6 days, 7 days. But there was a lot of these 1 day turnaround times. And then we looked at the second one was the issue of one or a handful of bidders being invited, and a lot of the emergency procurement, just one bidder was invited to put a bid forward, and then the issue of the non-competitive method that is applied or that is used, and that was prevalent as well. Of course, it was emergency procurement through the use of the direct procurement method. So this was prevalent during that lockdown period from late March to early May 2020. These are concerning issues. But what was also concerning for us, as I pointed out, we looked at the issue of what access we could get to company records, was that we randomly picked 40 companies from the various lists we had, and then we just tried to see if we could access the company information. And in almost half the cases, we couldn't get any company information through the Business and Intellectual Property Authority company interface. we couldn't access the information. And then we did an across-the-counter information request, and we couldn't access the information that way either. So, I mean, it raises some important questions around if, if this company information of some of these companies is not, available on request. Are government officials responsible for public procurement, are they doing rigorous background checks on the sort of companies that are bidding for government contracts? Because, I mean, if we can't access that information, and in some cases, the issue was that files had been handed to people across the counter, and those files had never been returned. So, for instance, a company file was missing from 2017. So, I mean, and this company has been getting government contracts. So, who does the due diligence, and how do they do due diligence around companies that are getting government contracts? So these are questions that need to be asked and need to be answered. Because there are serious concerns around this, and we need to be able to see who the beneficial owners of these companies are, whether these are bona fide concerns. Now, the issue here is that, and it's not just a Namibian issue, is that a lot of companies that are getting contracts are CCs, closed corporations, that are sort of multi-purpose vehicles, multi-purpose entities. And you have these multi-purpose entities getting personal protective equipment and medical supplies, contracts from the state. And these might not actually be medical suppliers or personal protective equipment suppliers. So are we really getting value for money out of these sorts of contracts? Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this. I'm not saying that there's necessarily corruption at play here, but these are the sort of things that we should be looking at, because these are the risk factors we should be identifying and interrogating around public procurement. And it's not just here, it's in a lot of other places as well. These sorts of issues have become a concern.
I think you're jumping my next question here, Frederico. Let's stay in order, please, and go to the chair's instructions. But yeah, those are very good. I especially like the comment on the due diligence in terms of state procuring authorities. How do you then decide what requirement a company gets to receiving a specific tender from government if we don't even know the beneficial ownership of that specific company? What are the dangers? What are the challenges with that? The challenges is we don't know where it's going to. The dangers with that is that we can't hold them accountable if anything is to go wrong, because if I don't know who owns a specific household and someone breaks in and steals whatever it is that they steal, how am I going to know who to come back and refer to? And I think those are some of the issues that you've recommended as well, to say that this is something of importance. I think, Frederico, from my side, the second last question that I might have is, are these concerns around public procurement during the era of COVID-19, are they just endemic to Namibia, or is it something that is seen globally? I know that you mentioned now the PPEs, and that being an issue in terms of companies getting awarded these contracts to provide our health facilities with PPEs, but there being no record of us receiving them. And we've seen this complaints through even our UNAM medical students that were marching earlier in the year to say they don't have PPEs. Our nurses and our doctors complain that there's a lack in terms of sufficient PPEs in the hospitals and in clinics. The issues that you have mentioned as red flags, are they just something that's happening this side of the world, or is it happening across the world?
I mean, it is a global problem. If you look at, I mean, in South Africa now, there are big investigations ongoing around public procurement contracting in COVID-19. So you had these inflated tenders from companies that have no history as suppliers of personal protective equipment, and overcharging and overpricing has been, an issue that has been flagged, where simple medical masks have become exorbitant. If you look at, and this information is all online, you can look at these spreadsheets and there's reports and so on, of just how the South African system has been abused by both by procurement officials and by the companies that involved. So there's a massive scandal unfolding in South Africa, to mention just one. In Zimbabwe, the same thing. There's the whole saga around journalist Hopewell Shinono, who was arrested after exposing massive COVID-19 procurement fraud by the health minister of the former health minister of that country, who stepped down in the wake of the scandal a few months ago. And this is still ongoing, and the repression that has followed that, the state repression that has followed the exposure of that grand scale corruption in Zimbabwe. And I mean, if you the Open Contracting Partnership published a report just a few months ago about where they looked at COVID-19 related procurement across various continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, and some parts of Latin America and so forth. And the picture that emerges, if you look at this report, is one of concern. And the issues are the concerns that we also have here: a lack of transparency, a lack of access to the procurement data sets, a lack of proper reporting on the sort of the procurement practices that have been undertaken during this period. Now, we do have access to some reports. If you go to the Ministry of Finance website and you go to the Procurement Policy Unit webpage, there's a Dropbox folder on that page, and in there you'll find reports from the first quarter of 2020, procurement reports for the period for that lockdown period under the state of emergency. And you'll find these documents there. But what you find there is spreadsheets. They're not actual reports. They're just spreadsheets. The reports would go into detail on why certain bidders were invited, to bid in these single bidder processes, and why, for instance, some procurement actions were allowed. Why was buying biltong, for instance, for the office of the presidency during this period? If you look at one of the spreadsheets there, how does buying biltong, fit into the whole emergency procurement under COVID-19? Why did a procurement transaction such as that need to be done through emergency procurement? Do we really need to apply that method to blanketly to all procurement, or can things like buying alcohol for and drinks for the president's guests, should that not fall outside of emergency procurement rules? So, I mean, these are the things that we should look at, that we should question, and that these are the sort of things that have also been flagged in other parts of the world. As I said, I mean, the Open Contracting Partnership has a report out that deals with a lot of these issues that we also see as concerning on the Namibian public procurement landscape. So there's information out there about, you know, the sort of practices and so on, and people have started taking, you know, globally have started taking a serious interest in what's happening in this space because of, you know, COVID-19 has also brought about a global decline in economic growth, and a global decline in local economies and so forth. So people are necessarily interested in seeing that government spending is done right, is follows the rules, that the waste is minimized, that you know, corruption is not allowed to derail service delivery in a time like this, and especially in Namibia, where we've been, you know, we've been facing economic headwinds for years now. Our economy is not in a good place at this stage in time. Government resources are limited. There are cutbacks across the board in the government sector. So we certainly don't want to hear of, you know, that money is being wasted, that money is being lost, that the rules aren't being followed, and waste has infiltrated this 2019 procurement landscape, 2020 procurement landscape, and that COVID-19 will become remembered as well for you know, the sort of things that are happening in South Africa, or that have happened in South Africa, where COVID-19 has become synonymous with government corruption, procurement corruption. So, you know, that's what we want to avoid, and that's what we want to keep an eye on going forward and at this time.
Thank you, Frederico. I think at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions or participants via our Zoom as well. If they have any questions that they'd like to pose to our expert in studio, Mr. Frederico Links, pertaining to procurement in the era of COVID-19. We are currently streaming live via our social media platform, which is Facebook under Namibia Media Trust, as well as we are engaging those others as well via our Twitter at NAM Media Trust. So I think I'll give the floor for a few minutes just to see if there are any questions, if you will allow me, Mr. Links. And I think this is also an opportunity for not only stakeholders such as the media or other government officials or NGO or civil society officials, but all those that feel that they have a pertinent question around the element of procurement in this space of COVID-19. I think Frederico has mentioned quite a few issues that I personally would like to dwell into if no one else is willing to. But let's just quickly see if we can have. Okay. We'll keep an eye out for questions that come in, Frederico, and as they pop up, I'll definitely inform you. Frederico, I want to find out what are some of the issues, or what advice do you have for journalists or anybody in the media space pertaining to the way of them dealing with issues around procurement? I think there've been a lot of questions to saying that media also has obviously a very important role to play. What advice would you give them in terms of probing and asking questions and making sure that transparency and good governance is undertaken, and holding our leaders and our politicians accountable?
Yes, I mean, I definitely, I mean, that's part of what we also try and do with the Procurement Tracker Namibia project, is trying to encourage journalists and the media in general to take an interest in what's happening in the public procurement space, because, as I said earlier, I mean, this affects governance. It affects how local authorities regions, how central government are managed. It affects the nature and quality of service delivery. So, I mean, we need to keep an eye on what's happening in this space, in the public procurement space. It's very important. We need to have the public procurement system reflect those principles which are right up front in the law itself: the transparency, accountability, integrity, those principles. It needs to be reflected in how the system is governed, in how the institutions are functioning, in their compliance to the law. I mean, there are so many examples out there. You see the reports all the time of systems and processes being flouted, and state institutions, their audits reflecting a poor governance of spending, and so forth. And all of these tie together to give an indication of to what extent, or of the quality of service delivery of the Namibian government. And that's where people need to keep their eye on this issue, because it affects all of us. If the system isn't functioning properly, if the public procurement system is malfunctioning or is dysfunctional, it affects the governance of this country. It affects the quality of government. And it affects us at the very basic levels, at grassroots levels, in terms of the hot button issues that affect our society: healthcare, housing, sanitation. All of these issues that are hot button issues, especially in these times of elections, that everybody's harping on about some of these issues, politicians and political parties and manifestos and so forth. These are the issues that they speak to, and these are the issues where spending is taking place and where they will try and influence spending going forward. So, it's important that, journalists keep an eye on what's happening in the system, because the soundness of the system will speak to all of those delivery outcomes that eventually also then influences the nature of our political system. And we want to, the aim is to try and foster a functional, a system that is optimal for Namibian conditions and that delivers at the end of the day for Namibians. So that is what I would say is why I think not just journalists, not just the media in general, but also ordinary Namibians should take a very keen interest in what's happening in the public procurement space, and should be seized with whether the system is functioning to deliver for Namibians, is functioning to deliver in the public interest. So that's ultimately what it's about.
Thanks, Federico. I think that was very important for us to also have an understanding of how we can always go about this. So often we think that we don't have as much power, but we actually hold all the power. Not to say that it's a power competition, but to say that it's an interest that's vested in everybody, and everyone has to be able to take their own approach. I think my last intervention, Federico, is we're talking about we're also in an era of access to information, and this is something that I know that Action has also been pushing for, and I know that you are the current chairperson of Action Coalition. If I'm not mistaken, you can correct me. I want to find out, in the area of access to information, how then can we hold government accountable? What is currently in the public domain or in the public's access for them to be able to reach information about contracts around public procurement, whether it be in the time of COVID or before? Is it easier now or is it harder now? And how then can the public or in general stakeholders go about in accessing this?
Yeah, so I mean, the situation has certainly improved over the last few years that we've been looking at the public procurement system. But it isn't where it should be. I mean, I don't believe there is a consolidated list of government suppliers that is accessible to the public. I haven't seen something like that, where you can see who has been receiving government contracts historically. We don't have that. I've seen a list of prices of regularly procured goods, where you can see what things cost. These are the things that government has historically been purchasing in bulk across the state sector. So that sort of thing. These are the sort of data sets that should be available, that organizations such as Open Contracting Partnership point to are missing in various parts of various countries in the world around the COVID-19 situation. But in general, these are the sort of things that engender transparency. And then proper reporting. You still find that, as I said, I mean, if you look at the sort of reporting that you're seeing state entities do, it's a spreadsheet. It's not a report. It's just a spreadsheet with columns, and they fill in information in those columns. Now, that's not a report. That's just a spreadsheet. A report is something that is much more comprehensive and deals with the issues in depth. And that's what we're not seeing. The quality of reporting on what's happening in public procurement is questionable. We need to have a proper reporting needs to be done, and not these spreadsheets we see state entities put together and submit to the PPU, for instance. And then there's some information missing in some of these columns in many cases. So there's an issue with the reporting. So if you don't have all the information, what sort of oversight can you provide in terms of what is actually happening? So there needs to be a complete reporting format that captures all the information, that captures all the data, that is accessible, that me as a researcher, that I can take a look at and see what's happening and draw and infer from and see what is busy happening, instead of we're hearing things being reported through the media, and then there's a whole reaction around that. So there are various things in terms of transparency where there needs to really be improvements, where that could speak to just improving accountability within these systems, improving detection of less than optimal practices or corrupt practices, and also improve feedback within the system itself, and people can see in real time, and I think this is important. People can see in real time if changes are made, if issues are addressed, if transactions are being investigated that have been flagged as possibly not above board. And these things really have to happen fast. They have to have an element of public oversight to them, where it isn't just that the information is limited to government departments, and it shouldn't be just a largely paper-based system, which I mean it still is at the moment. The system should really be moving, and COVID-19 should take us there. This should be the wake-up call, where we move this system online, and use the technologies available to try and get a system that is is not as easily gameable as this paper-based organizational sort of a limited system where it is hard to get information out of individual government departments, because this is also an issue I understand that has plagued the procurement policy unit in the Ministry of Finance. So there really is, I mean, transparency is one of those issues that we at the Procurement Tracker Namibia project this is one of the focus areas, because this is where we feel a lot of the systemic issues break down because of a lack of transparency, because of a lack of openness. And this then leads to a lack of accountability. It leads to impunity, and a general culture of non-compliance with the law.
Thanks, Federico. I think we've taken a lot from that bite to say that, at the end of the day, if it's not transparent, the system will ideally have more risks and flaws and other challenges that might essentially cripple us. I think at this point, we've covered a lot of base in terms of identifying what the biggest issues are in terms of procurement during this time of COVID-19. I think what boggles me the most is knowing or having an idea to say that we don't even have a comprehensive due diligence process that's done on companies that are tendering for government. And at this point, if we as researchers don't have access to this information, then what is government claiming it on? How are they putting this up to say that this is the reason as to why the specific company gets a specific contract? Or the fact that we don't have detailed reports, and that's on the progress of whatever company it is, or on the fact that we also have contracts coming through from government side, and we don't know if we are able to give part to that. I think we've got a few questions coming in. Francis has asked if he can contribute to this discussion. Yes, Francis Brunt, you can contribute to this discussion. I think Francis is representing the PPP unit. I'm assuming because it says the PPP unit. Over and above that, please also do take note that we are currently taking in questions from our social media platforms, and that's whether it be on Twitter at NAM Media Trust, as well as on Facebook, where we're currently streaming live, which is Namibia Media Trust, where you can be able to give your intervention. I think Federico has covered quite a bit of base in terms of journalists as well, and I would also like to inform journalists to come through with their specific questions. We did receive a few questions via email. I'm just waiting on those to be put through, Federico, and then we can proceed with that. I think the one thing that I'd also like to take out from this is to say that during this current pandemic, not only looking at issues of procurement, but everything else and how we've responded to what's happening on the ground. Would you say that you're I don't want to say this, but would you say that you're satisfied in the response from a procurement perspective in terms of how government responded to the current pandemic here in Namibia? Because I mean, we've seen the same issue also being highlighted across the world, but since we're focusing in and zooming in Namibia, what would your stance be? Do you think that government could have done more in responding, or on how they chose to approach their response to COVID-19 in various aspects? Or would you have a recommendation as to how they could have done it better?
I think I'd like to actually invite Francois Brunt into this at this stage. I just like to say, I mean, I did ask the Ministry of Finance before this latest report that we released, could we have a report of the COVID-19 procurement? Could they provide of the lockdown period that in late March to early May period? Could we have a report of what happened in the public procurement space during that period? And I understand a call was put out to various public entities to submit reports to this effect. It was in the newspapers as well. But I haven't seen received such a report. Perhaps Francois Brandt could speak to this in his response to this.
Thank you, Frederico and Martha. Can you see me, or can you hear me at least?
We can hear you, Francois. You can proceed.
Thank you. I wanted to address a few elements that was during this discussion. I've been following your discussion with quite a lot of interest. It's been really, really interesting. And I think that, from the procurement policy unit side, these public interactions with regards to public procurement is of the utmost importance. And therefore, we are quite serious about staying up to date. We are, of course, always looking at the procurement tracker, reading it. In the future, it would also be good if we are able to potentially contribute to it. We've recently increased our capacity and believe that at this stage there might be some opportunity for improved contribution to that. Since I was appointed as the head of the PPU in October, we've engaged in quite a few projects with regards to the procurement system. One being a decongestion project to decongest some of the big challenges that we have been facing, and that's preventing the efficient execution of public procurement. But to have a bit of a structured response, I wanted to start with where this discussion started, which was the emergency procurements that took place in between March and May. And so the PPU, through the Minister of Finance, there was a directive issued calling for the ceasing of all procurement, except for procurement on PPEs. And those procurements were then directed, of course, to be procured under emergency procurement. Very similar to the drought emergency that was called. And then some of that emergency procurement took place for the drilling of boreholes, and so forth. Because when a country faces an emergency, you do not want your procurement bureaucracy to stifle addressing the human needs within the system. Now, as Frederico rightly said, if you look at our neighbours, if you look at the UK situation currently, there's a significant concern about the abuse of emergency procurement. And a call has been made out for provision of reporting on the emergency procurement. And we are still busy with that process. So we do not have an update for you on that yet. However, some of the areas identified, not just in emergency procurement, but also elsewhere, we are trying to now address through an amendment to the Act. So that's a process that's been in progress, and we'll be going into stakeholder consultations early next year. And I believe that will create a fantastic opportunity also for broad input into the amendment. So I'm sure that will also provide an opportunity, not just for organizations like IPPR, who has an interest in this, but also for the general public and other organizations to provide their input. There was a discussion about the short turnaround times of procurement. I would be interested in a little bit more information on that. I'm not sure if that was limited now to the emergency procurement or whether that was just in general. And that's definitely something that we agree with. For a more competitive procurement process, you want to provide more opportunity for bidding to take place and also for more preparation so that you have increased quality of submissions. Then at the end, Frederico mentioned a few things that I think is quite important, which is a national supplier list. This is, of course, an important criteria in any public procurement system, and the Act quite clearly states that this is under the ambit of the Procurement Policy Unit. Now, this is something that we're driving towards with the rolling out of an e-government procurement portal. So this e-government procurement portal, which we are launching next year, will have a basic, it's a basic portal where we will be allowing the public to have access to bids that are openly advertised, where they can see who's been awarded to bid opening reports and so forth. And this will allow for a bit more transparency and accountability in the system, a bit more access to information. And I think, as you would also know, the more information you have electronically, the more easier it is to generate reports. So you're not stuck with significant amounts of Excel sheets and Word documents that are not even formatted correctly, and then you need to number crunch. I think Frederico understands, data capturing and analysis is quite a timely activity especially if the data entry is not of the best quality. So we believe with the e-government procurement, we will be addressing quite a significant amount of challenges that we're facing. E-government procurement in phase 2 and 3 will look at integrating with organizations like BIPA, Social Security, and also the ITA system. We want to look at confirming identities, confirming whether organizations are youth, women owned, and so forth. So these are the sort of engagements and interactivity that the e-procurement system will provide. Additionally, the e-procurement system at phase 2 and 3 will have comprehensive data analysis capability. We want to start identifying trends. We want to start using it to inform policy much more in the future. Now, what will also come out of this is another topic that was mentioned, which is price schedules. So there are 2 ways to do price schedules. One is looking at historical procurement data, or going into the market and looking at current prices in the market. And so we are looking at both of these at this stage. However, it's not been prioritized to receive immediate attention due to limited resources, but it is in our scope and within our mandate. Which then leads me to the next one, which was, I'm not sure if it was mentioned by name, but what we tend to call common goods and services. Now, this internationally is sort of by using a catalog approach, using an e-procurement system. And so we are now setting up an interministerial committee with Ministry of Works to discuss not just common goods and services, but also other elements that relate to it, which you can probably assume would be then government stores, which is part of this process. So how do we reform the public procurement system with the existing structures that are in place? So we need to do this in a much more strategic and cohesive approach. We yesterday had a workshop with Ministry of Health and Social Services together with a significant number of development partners to try and better understand what are the challenges faced within the Ministry of Health and Social Services. I mean, are these challenges logistics, warehousing, stock management, or are they really procurement problems? And are the procurement problems with the Act, or is it with regards to the processes and the relationship with the Central Procurement Board of Namibia? And then how do we address the areas that we've identified to be problem areas? So I think we identified about 26. I think 18 of them are quite significant, and we will then come up with strategies on how to address this. We have also been receiving support from development partners to address the capacity gaps that we are facing. This is just a short little overview and feedback on some of the issues that I heard being discussed in this forum. Thank you for this. It's a good forum, and I look forward to engaging with you guys in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. I think I would like to please just keep you on. Frederico made mention about how the procurement tracker had requested for a report initially before finalizing their last briefing report or briefing paper. Are you aware of this?
I'm aware of the request. We have not finalized the data gathering as well as the reporting thereof.
Okay. Frederico, do you have any questions that you'd like to discuss with Francois before he steps off the podium and before I close off the channel?
Francois, if you look at the Dropbox folder on the PPU webpage, in that you'll find that first quarter 2020-2021 reports, those spreadsheets, and you'll see the turnaround times there on some of those spreadsheets are 24 hours. So just look at those spreadsheets and you'll see, because we screenshotted some of them in this last report that this briefing paper on red flags. And some of these are the things that we screenshotted from those spreadsheets that are in those folders. And that's where we saw the 24-hour or 3-day or 2-day turnaround times. And you can see them there. But in general, I mean, I'm glad to hear that all of these concerns that have been sort of plaguing the public procurement system over the last few years are being focused on, are being prioritized, and we certainly would like to be contributing to some of these processes. And of course, I mean, we'll continue tracking some of what's busy happening through the current and the next financial year. And we'd like to, of course, encourage the use of an e-procurement system, because we feel that's where a lot of the corruption and the waste can be sort of, gotten out of the system. So, I mean, it's good to hear that these things are unfolding and are ongoing at this stage. And we did hear about the processes that you referred to lastly with the Ministry of Health and Social Services. And we were sort of wondering, I mean, what will come out of this? So, I mean, this is something that I would like to take a look at in our first newsletter in the new year. What came out of these processes, because we did hear that something like this was busy happening. So yeah, I mean, thank you very much for coming on here and speaking to us on these critical issues. And we'll certainly be reaching out to the PPU through the Ministry of Finance on issues that we think need to be clarified in the public interest.
I'd like to second what Frederico just said. Before we just move on, we have one question, and I would like to play devil's advocate and actually give it out to both of you if you don't mind. And the question says, please advise a good method of assessing the effectiveness of public procurement. Francois, we'll put you up first, and then Frederico can go on.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. It's a very good question. So we tend to confuse effectivity with efficiency. So on the one hand, you want to make sure your system is efficient, that you can have processes that are easy to follow and quite clear and straight, and it doesn't create any bureaucratic stoppages, and that can allow for a swift procurement to take place within the ambit of the time periods of the Act. The effectivity of the system is a very, very broad term, because you want to look at what are the objectives of the Act. So it is not just to supply the civil servant with a pen. You also want to contribute towards the empowerment policies as set out, I think, in Section 3 of the Act. You want to contribute towards, internationally, you want to contribute towards strengths in the realm of innovation, in the realm of sustainable procurement, green procurement. And you want to make sure that eventually we reach that stage, and that the pen potentially is locally probably manufactured from recyclable tree bark, as an example. So, in the future, that's something that you want to move towards. However, with any new procurement system around the world, the first 2 or 3, even 4 or 5 years could be very much dedicated towards compliance. You just want to make sure everybody's compliant. And then you want to move towards a process of being much more efficient and much more strategic in your procurement. So, capacitating the Central Procurement Board of Namibia and capacitating the Procurement Policy Unit of Namibia, and making sure that we are fully functional was of the utmost importance to ensure that the procurement system works well. That includes, of course, the review panel. Now, there are 200 roughly public entities also needs to be capacitated. And this is, of course, one of the key challenges that we will continue to face. We have benchmarked with countries. There are some neighboring countries who've had a new Public Procurement Act in place for about 21 years by now, facing exactly the same challenges that we're facing. So we've also received some good news that we're doing really well compared to some other countries. So I think we need to continue to hold hands. We need to have a concerted, cooperative approach. We need to say that one cannot solve it all, and continue to work together. And our perspective on working together has always been public, private, and civil society. We need to see that we somehow find a way of not working in silos, that we do not engage just when we want input, and do not give feedback. It needs to be a bit more substantive in the future. So we look forward to that, and I believe that using a concerted strategic approach, you can then contribute to the not the efficiency, but the effectiveness of the Act, in contributing towards all its objectives as set out in Section 2 of the Act.
Thanks, Francois. Fred, before you continue, I'd like for you to also just give like an outro before we close up this session. Thank you so much, Francois, for giving your input from the PPP unit. I'm very happy to hear that we're doing quite a lot of advancements. We're talking about the e-procurement system that's going to be advanced and evolved. We're talking about public-private civil society partnership. I really, really like that. I just want to encourage you that next year when you go out to your stakeholder engagement, please don't forget us. Please do not forget civil society, don't forget media and everyone else and the likes. So Federico, the question was, please advise a good method of assessing the effectiveness of public procurement. And with that, I'm giving you the responsibility of signing out, if you do not mind. And make it very brief, Mr. Links.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the best is to just take a look at the act. Look, I mean, in general, we don't have, I mean, since the processes around the new Public Procurement Act was started, we've been issuing briefing papers and guidance and notes and so on. And we find that this law is you know, it is standard setting in our part of the world. And we would like it to be given life, the life that it speaks to. You know, those principles at right up in the front of the text. And this is what is important to us, because that is what we feel, that is how we feel, you know, the public interest is served, and that's what the law itself states, which is why we're so concerned about some of the practices that we've been seeing throughout the system, that we've become aware of over the last 3 or so years. So yeah, so that's what we, and I think that is where, if you look at the law itself, that is where you will find this best practice checklist, because the law provides us with that checklist. So if you're interested in public procurement, and as I said throughout this the Zoom call, everybody needs to take, every Namibian needs to take an interest in this. If you're interested in public procurement, if you're interested in governance in this country, and everybody at this stage should be interested because of the things that we've seen happening, not just around public procurement, but also around government licensing, quota systems, all of these. We should really be taking an interest in the quality of governance of systems and processes. If you're really interested in that, take a look at the law, get to know it. Look at the regulations, get to know it. And that's the basis on which we judge whether the system is functioning. Now, there are areas that are up for amending, and that we've also earlier not this year, but last year, we issued some IPPR take on some of the proposals. So, you know, this is where we need to actively take an interest in what is busy happening in this space, because it affects all of us, and the nature of governance of the country. So that I think that would be my outtake at this point.
Thanks, Federico. Thank you so much to everyone that has tuned in. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Namibia Media Trust for having yet another Ask the Expert session, and in support of that as well, the DW Akademie for supporting NMT. Thank you to all of our viewers, whether it be on Zoom call or via the Facebook platform. Please do take note that this session is being recorded right now, and it will be saved, and you can view it on the NMT, which is the Namibia Media Trust YouTube page. Thank you so much to the PPP unit's contributions. And from us, it is a wrap. Until next time.